The Escadrille Americaine had been in the thick of fighting since the previous spring, when the squadron had taken part in the terrible battle raging at Verdun. The all-volunteer squadron had suffered its first fatality in June, when Victor Chapman, a native of New York City, had been shot down by a pair of Fokkers. Chapman, coming from a distinguished family background, had epitomized the spirit of idealism that had brought this group of young Americans to fight under the French flag. After graduating from Harvard, he'd been studying architecture in Paris when Germany had invaded, and he'd immediately enlisted in the Foreign Legion, determined to do his part to preserve the liberty of France. Victor Chapman was the first American airman to die in the war. A profound outpouring of emotion swept across the French people as political and military leaders honored the volunteers' great sacrifice. The story of Chapman's death also received prominent coverage in newspapers across the United States, and the American public, hungry for first-hand accounts of the war in Europe, began to eagerly follow the exploits of the Escadrille Americaine. In the wake of this publicity, dozens of young American men set sail for France with the intention of enlisting into the famous squadron. The battle for Verdun had proven particularly grueling for the outnumbered flyers of the French air service, but when the British finally began their offensive in the Somme region and some German squadrons were redeployed to the north, the situation improved. In the weeks following Victor Chapman's death, the flyers of the Escadrille Americaine began to show some success, when Bert Hall, Norman Prince, Kiffin Rockwell, and Captain Thénault each scored victories. On the last day of July, Raoul Lufberry began a 4-victory spree that culminated with a pair of German planes shot down on August 4th. In mid-September, the Escadrille was pulled out of Verdun and sent to Le Bourget, the great aviation center on the outskirts of Paris. The Americans had accounted well for themselves, and the squadron victory roster sat at 12 kills. At Le Bourget, the squadron was to receive Newport 17s, and while awaiting their new machines, they drank their way through what seemed like every cafe and bar in the French capital. It was during this stay in Paris that the Escadrille acquired their famous mascot, Whiskey, a young lion that the flyers bought for the price of 125 francs. The sight of the drunken American aviators and their lion mascot prowling the sidewalks of Paris must have raised more than a few eyebrows among that city's population. A few months later, after deciding that Whiskey needed a sweetheart, a young lioness was procured, which the pilots named Soda. When the American flyers received their new aircraft, they were issued orders sending the squadron back to Luxeuil, the same field where they'd begun their operational flying earlier in the year. Almost immediately, the Escadrille suffered its second loss when Kiffin Rockwell fell into a trap set by German fighters, sitting in high weight above a seemingly helpless two-seater. Rockwell fell just behind the French lines, not a mile from where he'd scored the Escadrille's first victory 4 months earlier. When pulled from his wrecked Newport, his squadron mates were horrified to see a large hole in his chest where an explosive bullet had scored a hit. That same morning, Lufberry had escaped a similar fate, when he too had attacked a German observation plane and had been swooped down on by 3 Fokkers. Only by the narrowest margin had he been able to escape the trap and had brought his machine home riddled with holes. The Escadrille Americaine had no sooner settled into their new home at Luxeuil when they received orders to move again, this time to Cachy, up north in the Somme. Cachy was a huge airfield that served as the home base for nearly a dozen escadrilles de chasse, including the celebrated Storks Group. The brightest star in this universe was, of course, George Guynemer, who had just blasted his 25th German from the air and was now flying the rugged Spad fighter. In late November, a single Spad was given to the American squadron, which Captain Thénault, exercising his prerogative as the commanding officer, kept for himself. More allotments of the new fighter were quick in coming, and the Escadrille gradually re-equipped. Shortly after their arrival at Cachy, the Americans were issued a directive from the French General Headquarters that the name Escadrille Americaine was causing problems between the French government and the U.S. State Department. America was still a neutral country, and the publicity the volunteer group was receiving had become the subject of a great protest with the German consul in America. A new name was needed, and the squadron finally settled on Lafayette Escadrille, in honor of the French general who'd aided the United States in the Revolutionary War. With their new name, the Escadrille also adopted a new insignia for their aircraft. Henceforth, the sides of all the machines of the Lafayette Escadrille would be adorned with the profile of an Indian chieftain,